Boker Tov, welcome back to our series on Sefer Bereishit. This week is Parashat Vayera, but again, we are going to focus on the underlying theme of Sefer Bereishit, and probably Vayera, Parashat Vayera, has one of the biggest themes developing, not only of Sefer Bereishit, the entire Torah, and basically the entire Tanakh, as we'll soon we will see. I want to talk about a very interesting phenomena in Sefer Bereishit, about God talking to himself. Ever since day one, God's talking to himself. We have no idea who he's talking to, what that means. We discussed that a little bit in our first share in the story of creation. But there's no doubt, ever since day one, the whole story of creation, God speaks to himself. Afterwards, when man is thrown out of Gan Eden, God now he speaks to himself. He seems to be speaking to his board members. He speaks in the plural. Man is like one of us. He might be like one of us. Let's throw him out before he eats from the tree of life. Not only is God talking to himself, every once in a while he'll talk to what I like to call his board members. Chazal identify them as the celestial angels above, which again is a very strange phenomenon. In fact, the first time we saw that was when God decides to make man. He speaks in the plural. Naseh Adam. Again, who is God talking to? Unclear. What is clear is that God talks to himself over and over again, and every once in a while, before he makes that decision, he consults with other, I call them again board members, without knowing who they are. Before the flood, God speaks to himself, and through that, God explains why he's bringing the flood. When the flood's over, God speaks to himself again and explains why he's not going to do that again. In the story of the Tower of Babel, God, now he speaks to himself. He speaks again to his board members, making that decision to let's go down and change their languages, causing mankind to spread out to different civilizations, the different languages, the different families, the different nations. And after chapter 11, that phenomena ends. In other words, in the first 11 chapters, which we said were universal, consistently, God is either speaking to himself or to his so-called board members. After God picks Avram Avinu, we rarely find that happening, only one more time, and again in Parashat Vayera. In other words, the last time God is going to speak to himself in the Torah is going to be in Parashat Vayera. And what I want to suggest, that must be important. I think that's intentional. The fact that God is consistently talking to himself before making major decisions is throughout the first 11 chapters, the universal section. And that ends, it happens only once in the story of Avram Avinu. I want to put importance in that understanding. Now, in addition to that, we also find every once in a while God having a dialogue with man. We have a very short dialogue between God and Adam HaRishon, but the context there is Adam HaRishon sinning. Adam sins, and God engages Adam HaRishon in the nature of his sin. Of course, he doesn't take responsibility. Something very similar happens with Cain, when Cain sins and kills his brother. But they don't have a conversation about the future of mankind. Rather, it's a conversation about reward and punishment and about God's expectations for man. Again, an important theme. From there, possibly we learn that God is involved in our lives and has expectations, and there is reward and punishment for good and bad behavior. But we don't find any dialogues between God and man in regard to a future or to a destiny. That, of course, begins in the first dialogue between God and Avram Avinu, in the famous Brit Ben Abtarim in chapter 15 we saw last week in Parashat Lech Lecha, where God enters a dialogue with Avram Avinu, and in that dialogue we find out about how the Jewish nation is going to be formed. God told Avram Avinu, I'll make you a great nation, I'm going to bless you with children, and you're going to have a land, and you're going to inherit and possess that land. But Avram finds out in that first dialogue, in chapter 15, that that's going to be a long historical process that has to first be preceded by those offspring, being in someone else's land, being oppressed, followed by redemption, and only after a difficult time period of some 400 years of enslavement and oppression, followed by redemption, and with great wealth, then they'll be able to conquer the land only after the local population of the Amorites sins badly enough for God to throw them out and allow the Jewish people to conquer it. That was the first dialogue between God and Avram Avinu. And there's only one more dialogue between God and Avraham Avinu, again in our Parsha, in Parashat Vayera. After that, we don't find another dialogue between God and our forefathers. There are two dialogues between God and Avraham Avinu. One in Parashat Lech Lecha, Brit Ben Abtarim, the covenant of the parts, about how the nation is going to become a nation. All those events of history, what we call the story of Yetziat Mitzrayim, ultimately. And the dialogue he has in regard to Sdom in Parashat Vayera. After that, we'll never find a dialogue similar in any manner to these two with either Yitzchak or Yaakov. The next time we find a major dialogue will be at the burning bush between God and Moshe Rabbeinu. So from all those directions, if I'm going to find a dialogue, a second dialogue between God and Avraham Avinu, that must be important, just like the first one was important. And if I'm going to find a God speaking to himself one last time, that must be important. And those 2 points bring us right to Parashat Vayera, where we're going to discover probably the biggest theme of the Torah, not only again of Sefer Bereishit, and that is the underlying purpose, not only why the Jewish nation is chosen, for what purpose they're chosen, but how they're expected to lead their lives, and what is the ultimate goal, and the relationship between God choosing a nation and its impact on other nations as well. And basically the whole theme we discussed in Rosh Hashanah of Malchiyot, what that concept means, understanding what we like to call God's kingdom and the destiny and the purpose of God choosing a nation. That story begins in Perik Yudchet, with the beginning of Parashat Vayera. If you open up your Chumash and take a look in a Tzach Koran or similar, you'll see that all of chapter 18 and all of chapter 19 is one Parshiah, that paragraph style of Chumash. The first two chapters, how many psukim is that? It's 33 verses in chapter 18, and a similar amount in chapter 19, even more, almost 40 some, almost 80 psukim, 70 some, 70, 80 psukim, all one Parshiah, and even though there's many different topics. So again, something special is happening, and why is Chumash putting all these topics together into one Parshiah? So let's trace what's happening in chapters 18 and 19, which is going to lead us not only to the final dialogue between God and Avraham Avinu, but also the last time that God will speak to himself, and how is that going to focus on the theme of Sefer Bereishit and the entire Tanakh. The first 8 verses of chapter 18 focus on what we like to call Hachnasat Orchim, or Avram and Sarah's hospitality to their guests. If you look at the first 8 psukim, I'm sure you remember them by heart, but almost every single one is focusing on the efforts that Avram and Sarah make to entertain their guests. Even the first pasuk, which sounds very technical, Rashi points out right away, why is Avram sitting outside his tent looking for guests? And when you look at the next 7 psukim, in verses 2 through 8, you can understand why Rashi reaches that conclusion, because the rest of those psukim is emphasizing all those efforts Avram Avinu is doing to invite the guests in, to give them food, entertain them, and make sure all their needs are taken care of. The next topic is the famous story. These same guests, who we find out later on are actually sent by God for various purposes. Their next thing that they do, after having their meal and being entertained, they tell Avram and Sarah the news that indeed they're going to have a child. Of course, as we like to say, that's no laughing matter. And the baby's name will be Yitzchak. They've been waiting decades to have a child. And finally, they're getting the good news not to give up hope. In a year's time, they'll be able to have a child. And therefore, they're encouraging them. In fact, they're angry with them. If they laugh about it, it might not happen. Therefore, take this seriously. You're going to have a child. And the future of this nation that I'm choosing will be through this child, through Yitzchak. That's the second topic. Again, all in the same Parshiah. The next topic is the conversation about Sdom. Now, if someone asks you, what is it that God tells Avram about Sdom? Most people would say, God is telling Avram Avinu his decision, he's going to destroy Sdom. And Avram begins to argue, sort of to pray for Sdom, and try to convince God not to destroy the city, or at least to save Lot. That's a standard understanding of what's happening. But we're going to read carefully, and we're going to find it's quite different. God is not sharing with Avram Avinu his decision to destroy Sdom. Rather, what I want to point out, God is sharing with Avram Avinu his deliberation whether he should or should not destroy Sdom. And that changes the story totally. In other words, it's not a question which a lot of people ask, why is Avram praying for Sodom and not for his own son later in the Akedah at the end of the Parsha? As I want to show you, he's not praying in the classic sense to save Sodom. Rather, God is sharing with him his deliberation, and they're having sort of a meeting and a discussion. Is it worthwhile or not to destroy Sodom? I want to point this out by reading carefully chapter 18, verse 20, which is when God tells Avram Avinu about his deliberation. Again, I want to show you, when God speaks to Avram Avinu, he did not decide, I'm destroying Sodom. Rather, he's sharing a deliberation. Again, in Perek Yudchet Pasuk Chaf, what does it say? Vayomer Hashem, Zakat Sodom v'amra ki rabba. There's a cry, Rashi explains, of oppression coming out of Sodom. Something is rotten down in that area. And what does God say next? Their sin is very heavy. V'chatatam ki kavda ma'od. Erdana ve'eren. God tells Avram, I'm going to go down and see her. We would like to say, I'm going to go down and check it out. Hatzakata haba elai osu kala bimlo ida. Is that cry of oppression, is it beyond repair? Is it finished, basically, or not? And God will know. If we had time, which we don't, these verbs we're going to find repeating themselves later in the story of the Exodus, just like we saw that the flood story is sort of a foil to understand what's going to happen at Har Sinai in Sefer Shemot. We're also going to see that this story of Sodom is the micro of what's going to happen in the macro of the story of coming out of Egypt. There'll be a cry of oppression. God's going to hear that cry. He's going to know. He's going to see. He's going to redeem. But he'll be involved. And God is upset when one nation oppresses another. So again, what is God telling Avram Avinu? Not that he decided to destroy Sodom. He's going to go down and check out, is it beyond repair, yes or no? And that is what God has to share with Avram Avinu. In light of that, it's a very different look at the conversation that ensues between God and Avram Avinu. Now, what does Avram say? Avram begins, remember, by Gash Avram v'Omar in Pasuk Chav Gimel, Avram turns to God and says, Ha'af tispet tzadikim rasha. Now, that could be a complaint about God, or it could be a statement of Avram's understanding, because it's what we like to call collateral damage. If there'll be some natural disaster that God's going to bring on Sodom, an earthquake, whatever it might be, some type of storm, whatever punishment he brings, the way of nature is, when there's a natural disaster, everyone is punished, whether they're righteous or not. When there's a massive bombing or massive destruction, everyone goes, and that's it. And if God decides to punish this evil city, the price we'll have to pay is some righteous people will be killed. And therefore, Avram doesn't ask God to go in and save the righteous. What does he say? If there's 50 righteous people in Sodom, would you save the entire city? Listen carefully. Avram didn't say, it's not fair that righteous are killed with the wicked, therefore go save the righteous. He says, it's a given. If you punish the city, righteous people will die. Therefore, save the entire city because of the righteous. Now, once Avram says that, what seems to be Avram's reasoning? If God is sharing his deliberation, should he or shouldn't he, Avram wants to understand the ways of God. And God wants Avram to understand the ways of God. And in his deliberation, we're slowly beginning to understand what the Jewish people were chosen for, as we'll see explicitly, the Torah will be explaining in a minute. In other words, the point that God wants Avram to know is that God expects man to be good. He wants society to be good. When society goes evil, God could bring a punishment upon that society, but God would rather that society fix itself. But because behavior is contagious, if there's a small group of righteous people in an evil society, God might put off that punishment, because if there's 50 righteous people, maybe tomorrow there'll be 60 or 70. And then Avram continues. Let's say five less tzaddikim, 45, and then 40. Remember, going down to 10. Even a minyan, even 10 righteous people in Sodom, not people righteous who do nothing wrong, people righteous who care about the injustice. If there be a demonstration, will there be a counter demonstration? If there's a small group of people, even 10, who care about injustice in the city, would God give that city another chance for recovery? And God informs Avram Avinu, that's true. If I find even a small group of righteous people, that gives me a reason to hold back punishment and give the city a chance, and give that leadership, that alternate leadership, a group a chance to do something about it, because God would rather society fix itself to do tshuva, to repent, instead of having to punish them. If it's beyond repair, then punishment has to come. Now, that concept that God expects society to be good and expects people in that society who see injustice to do something about it and complain, that understanding, and which I like to call again the behavior is contagious, is key to understanding why God chose Avram Avinu. And the answer is in the 3 verses that Chumash inserts before this conversation between God and Avram Avinu take place. After the first 2 sections, after God tells Avram Avinu through the Malachim that he's going to have a child with Sarah, and after their great Hachnasat Orchim, after their great caring of the guests, what does Chumash do? Chumash takes a break, and for the last time in Chumash, God will talk to himself. That's going to be in verse 17. I'll start with verse 16, when the 3 guests get up to leave. In verse 16, Vayakumu misham anashim, the 3 men get up. Vayashkiv al pnei stone. Again, Avram's an Elonei Mamre. He's overlooking stone. V'Avram holech imam leshalcham. Avram is on his way to send them out. And the next verse in the narrative should be verse 20, where one of these 3 men representing God tells Avram about his deliberation, Sakat Som V'Amar Ki Rabba. But before the story continues, Chumash takes a break. I like to call it the deep voice narrator of Chumash. And Chumash tells us, the reader, Vashem Amar, God had said, and one last time God had said to himself, again, the last time God speaks to himself, Hamachaseni ma'Avraham asher ani yoseh. Can I hide from Avram what I'm about to do? What's God about to do? He's not about to destroy Sodom. He's about to make the decision whether he should or not. And now I need an explanation. Why must God share his deliberation with Avram Avinu? And the reason has nothing to do immediately with saving his nephew Lot. Rather, it's about the future of Avram Avinu. There must be a connection between God's decision to choose Avram to start a nation and God sharing his deliberation with Avram Avinu. Why? It says explicitly in verse 18. Easy to remember, 18:18, Chai Chai in Chumash. Chumash tells us, or God speaking to himself, saying that because Avram is destined to become this great nation, we're going right back to Parashat Lech Lecha, through Avram Avinu, God can bring blessing to other nations by Avram being that model nation other nations can learn from. And now in verse 19, we finally find out what was the underlying purpose of God choosing a nation and beginning a nation, starting in Sefer Bereishit. Ki dativ, which does not mean that God knows, but rather God came to know him. It doesn't say here ki adati. God isn't saying because I know, but rather ki dativ. I came to know him, or I chose him for what reason? Leman asher yitzaved banav ved beito acharav, in order that Avram would command his children and they their children. V'shamru derech Hashem, that the offspring of Avram would follow the ways of God. And remember that phrase derech Hashem will be repeated numerous times all through the Torah. What are the ways of God? Lasot tzedakah u'mishpat, to do justice and righteousness. Leman havi Hashem al Avram et asher diber elav, in order that God's goal for Avram to become a nation, to start a nation that will bring blessing to other nations, the way that that will happen, if the nation of Avram, if his children and they their children, and we begin this family and later a national tradition of doing justice and righteousness, we become the nation representing God. We become that small group of tzaddikim that can have an effect on an evil society by being that nation that other nations can learn from. That's going to be the destiny and the goal of the Jewish people. And therefore, the theme of tzedakah u'mishpat, of a nation doing justice and righteousness, becomes a mega theme throughout the entire Tanakh. Read the first chapter of Isaiah. I'm sure you're familiar. What will bring redemption? You'll see it basically almost every single Navi. Yirmiyahu speaks about it over and over again. Almost all the later prophets, when they come to explain why is God bringing destruction on the people and why is God destroying the temple and sending us into exile, because the society is not doing justice and righteousness. It's throughout Yirmiyahu and throughout Yeshayahu. And if there's going to be redemption, it's that type of behavior that makes us worthy of redemption. And then we finally are finding out, again, in the last time that God speaks to himself, and the last dialogue he has with our ancestors, with Avram Avinu, we're finally finding out, little by little, what was the underlying purpose of God choosing a nation in the first place. God wants a nation that will be involved with other nations. He's going to give them a land located on the crossroads of the Middle East where we'll have a lot of visibility. People will hear about us. We'll be involved with them. We have the ability of becoming a superpower, becoming a great nation that other nations can look up to. But the way we behave as a nation, that will facilitate our ability to have an impact on other nations. But it all has to happen through the nation acting in a way of justice and righteousness. Without that happening, our goal won't be fulfilled. And that therefore becomes a mega theme, not only in the rest of the Torah, but also in the rest of Tanakh. All through Chumash, V'alachta bidrachav, L'lechet b'derech Hashem, all through Sefer Devarim, Moshe tells the people, that's what we need to do. Walking in the ways of God, L'lechet b'derchav, we say it every day in Shema, means living a life of justice and righteousness. So, in this beautiful story of Sdom, again, we didn't get into the details of Sdom, but I'm sure you remember when the shlichim, when God's messengers go to Sdom to check out the city, what happens? They stay outside the city, pretending to be transients. No one invites them in except for Lot. Lot happens to be a tzaddik in Sdom, but there's a rule in Sdom, as Ramban explains so beautifully, and as Yecheskel says explicitly in chapter 16, in Yecheskel, in verses 48 and 49, the sin of Sdom was there was a beautiful city, prosperous, but very affluent, tremendous wealth and quiet, but they couldn't care less about the poor and the needy. As Pirkei Avot says, the meaning of Sdom, what's mine is mine, what's yours is yours, and that's the way they live their life. No chesed, no tzedek, no, there might be mishpat in Sdom, but no tzedek for sure, no tzedakah, and therefore God decides to destroy the city. But the entire city, from young to old, kol ha'am mikatzeh, minar v'ad zaken, the entire city protests when Lot harbors these guests. And therefore God sees there aren't 10 righteous people in Sdom, there's no counter-protest, and God decides to destroy the city. So if I go back to the first question, why is Lot saved? So the Torah tells us at the end, when God destroys Sdom because of their evil behavior, in theory, Lot should have been destroyed, because that's what happens, but because Avram prayed, because God remembered Avram Avinu, and does a surgical raid to save Lot, because Lot was a tzaddik. So usually, if you follow the Rambam in Hilchot Shuvah, usually when things happen, they happen to the group, but someone at a very high level, and when tefillah, when prayer is done properly, God could intervene and do a surgical type raid to save someone, but that's not the normal way of nature, but that can happen if a righteous purpose prays for somebody else. Again, it's not by chance that the rabbis learned the concept of tefillah, of prayer, from Avram Avinu. And I like to say one could argue that the prayer means to argue, because Avram Avinu is arguing with God, not God, you're wrong, I'm right, but rather he's arguing and discussing with God, giving God a reason why he could save a city, or why he should save Sdom, or why maybe he should save Lot. But our prayers are also a type of argument with God, trying to explain why it's in God's interest to do something better for us and not bring a punishment. Again, we went a little overtime today on Parashat Vayera, but simply there's a lot to talk about. We'll continue this theme throughout Sefer Bereishit. We'll end today with that thought. But again, what I want to point out and summarize is that when I follow the underlying theme of Sefer Bereishit and pay attention to these phenomena of God talking to himself and God having conversations, and the fact he talked to himself so many times in the beginning, all building up to the end, the last time he talks to himself, what I like to say is, up until chapter 11, God's board members are up in heaven. Now, he chooses Avram Avinu, God has new board members down here on earth. And when God makes a decision, his decisions are not only based on the deeds of civilization, his decisions are based on people's prayers, because if God sees in prayer, people care about injustice. If through prayer we can show God that we care, we want to make things better, that gives God a good reason to put off punishment and give us a chance to make things better. If God sees that nobody cares, if no one's praying properly, and we don't show God how much we care, and we don't act in a way that makes us worth it being saved, then prayer would not be answered, especially if prayer doesn't take place. So in light of that, we can understand beautifully why Chazal understand we learn tefillah from Avram Avinu, tefillah shacharit, and why tefillah keneged avot. Tefillah corresponds to the stories of our ancestors, Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. Everyone should have a wonderful day.